Do you need a web application security solution that can improve your detection rate and enable easier remediation? Acunetics has a fully automated solution that can detect and report over 4,500 web vulnerabilities. Fast and scalable, it can scan thousands of pages without interruption, including HTML5, JavaScript, and single-page applications. Acunetics provides accuracy with the lowest false positives by combining black box and white box testing. For more information, visit acunetics.com/securityweekly.
Welcome back, everyone. One quick announcement before we jump into our interview with Matt. If you are interested in quality over quantity and having meaningful conversations instead of just a badge scan, join us April 1st to the 3rd at Disney's Contemporary Resort for InfoSec World 2019, where you can connect and network with like-minded individuals in search of actionable information. Use the registration code OS19-SecWeek for 15% off the main conference or World Pass. And I will say, having been down to Disney World on a number of occasions that time of year, the Flower and Garden Festival over in Epcot is awesome, especially the food. So just, for those that are going to attend, I make a strong recommendation to get your way over there. The beverages, I was about to say the booze, but the beverages are quite nice. So with that, Matt Springfield is the founder of 12 Feet Incorporated, an information security consulting firm based in the Dallas area. Matt has more than 23 years of information security experience spanning operations, architecture, and consulting with a focus on large-scale retail and service provider environments. He has helped some of the world's largest companies build and enhance their security programs and IT operations, managing consulting engagements in more than 20 different countries around the world. Matt Springfield, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Very glad to have you here. Matt, I got to ask, before we jump into some of your background here and a little bit more about your talk at InfoSec World, what was the most interesting country that you've been to?
I got a chance in 2012 to go to Johannesburg, and there's a couple of things about that. It is just you realize how far away you are from home when you go down to kind of that southern tip on the other side of the world. But it was an incredibly interesting experience. I enjoyed it.
Very cool. Very cool. So, Matt, I know that you focused on large-scale services and internal cloud or data center security architectures. I think, as far as I recall from some of my notes here, that's some of what your talk is about at InfoSec World. So your talk, Evolution of Security Architecture in a Services-Based World, is what you're going to be giving there. Talk to me a little bit about what that means in terms of some of the high levels of things that you're planning to talk about.
So being fortunate enough to be in the information security industry for as long as I have been, the way we used to do things, things were a lot more static. The environments were a lot less dynamic. We actually had better ideas on where our data was and how to secure it. At least we could build physical boundaries around some of our data. And as we've seen that shift and with the introduction of virtualization technologies and DevOps and serverless and microservices, that's a harder problem to solve now. And a lot of organizations this is just becoming a part of their environment, and they're struggling to adapt to, what do we need to do from an architecture perspective to help meet these changes? Because my data is no longer in one place, and now it is spread everywhere and controlled by a CI/CD pipeline. And as security professionals, what I'm focused on is helping drive the discussion on bringing this up and making sure that organizations are aware of this change and how it affects how security professionals work with the environment and look at some best practices, things that we can do in following this change.
So I've got to ask, in your experience over, how many of the last several years have you seen DevOps crop up? Again, working with large companies, I imagine that there are times where you see the infamous water scrum fall, but how much is DevOps really taking in those environments that you're working in?
So it's kind of fairly humorous in the fact that generally when I see DevOps pop up from a security perspective, it's always in some type of audit or assessment where, again, as security professionals, we need to better our craft, but also as audit professionals and some of the standards organizations, there's really a gap in how the standards adapt to things like DevOps and things like developers actually having access to production to make production changes. And how do we adjust those kind of things from a standards perspective? Because a lot of times that when I see it come up, it's in some type of assessment. It's a finding of some type of audit or assessment, internal audit, external audit, ISO, PCI, things of that nature, where I think that area of the environment is not changing quickly enough, because we see and we know that there are ways to apply security in the DevOps role, in the DevOps process. But getting kind of those rigid standards to understand and educate, that's generally where I've seen it pop up quite a bit.
Awesome. So one of the things that I remember us talking about is the architectural challenges from moving from a monolith to a microservices world, especially in CI/CD infrastructure. What are some of the things that you've encountered as maybe some good practices, but also, especially for the security professionals out there, some of the things that maybe they should be paying more attention to, right? Because DevOps is a pretty big world, and I imagine zeroing in on a few things will help some of our listeners, go back and find some things to read.
Well, it's kind of interesting, because it used to be, source code repository was for source code, right? Developers use it kind of in a very small scoped area. And now we see, things like Git being used for everything in the world, from, people using it to back up files, networks using it to back up network configs, massive role in how infrastructure is now provisioned and managed and rolled out, how all of our automation tools are actually being used, and all of our automation scripts, our chef recipes, our Ansible playbooks, we find in these type of tool sets in the environment. I mean, just from a CI/CD pipeline perspective, as security professionals, that's got to be a focus now where maybe it wasn't in the past. Maybe we weren't so concerned where the user app guy kept his source code, but now that repository is used to basically control a good portion of the enterprise. In some of my experiences, I've seen, because that has needed to be so widely accessed, there hasn't been a lot of security control or focus on things like Nexus and GitHub and kind of that whole CI/CD pipeline role, where I think that there's a lot of opportunity for security. As security professionals, we need to be paying close attention to that. I mean, that's one piece. The other piece is a lot of dependency, understanding what our apps are using from a services perspective. We see services getting, a single app consuming multiple services across the internal enterprise, as well as even public cloud. But how, as in the security perspective of that, does security know what's being used? Do we understand what the provider and consumer relationship is there? Do we understand the security requirements of the data that is being handled across all of these? And I think that's another big gap that we see is, number one, knowing where it is, right? We have to understand where it is so we can secure it. Number two, understanding that provider-consumer relationship and what the requirements are on the data to make sure the whole ecosystem is meeting the requirements.
Are there any specific tips that you have in terms of trying to build some of that data back into your process, right? To your point, right? It's okay. We got one server. We just get the web logs. We call it a day. But if you have one microservice for the web server, one microservice for the database, another microservice for maybe part of the functionality for logging in. Are there any recommendations or guidance or even tooling that you recommend around how to capture some of that data? Is it captured on the hosting level, where if you're doing something in AWS or Azure, you capture it there? Is it maybe Splunk or similar agents like Logarithm, et cetera, that live on the box and send back kind of a drip feed of that data? How do you recommend maybe capturing some of that?
So I think that's a great question. And I think there's a lot to be learned from how the service providers that we normally use. You look at companies like Amazon, Azure, Rackspace, how those companies have traditionally developed services and made those particular services available to their customers is really key in how we look at how we do that internal to our own organizations. So really the key element in this is understanding, like I said before, understanding where the services are and what's being consumed, and then also understanding the provider-consumer relationship for those services. So we have the providers that are providing services. So my bank provides me a service for me to put my money in because I expect it to be inherently more secure than me just digging a hole in the backyard and keeping it there. So the bank is a provider, I'm a consumer, but that bank, I'm not going to put my money in a bank that's, less secure than any type of environment that I could provide myself. So therefore I inherit what the risks that the bank has. I'm not going to go to somebody who's not FDIC insured. So I have expectations on my provider and my consumer. So a service provider, the real rule is the service provider should not or should only provide services to a consumer of the same or less security requirements that it has itself. And then a consumer should only consume service from providers that have the same or greater security requirements. That whole relationship That's the dynamic that you have to really apply across all of how we share these. So back to the previous statement of how does Amazon do it? How does Azure do it? When they create their services to meet or exceed all of the security requirements that their customer base has. They understand their consumers. They understand their customer base. So when they create a new compute service, as an example, that compute service is going to be validated for PCI, for SOC 2, ISO standards, anything that their customer base could possibly need. That service will be ready to do that. And so if we look at that model and we're creating services internally as an organization, to the extent that we can secure those services at that highest level, then they can be consumed by the different applications of different security needs. Then that really cuts out a lot of the inheritance problem that we have from the service consumption perspective.
So how does serverless play into all of this, right? Because at the end of the day, you end up having one of those situations of you don't have a server, you don't have an infrastructure that's you're talking to, you don't have agents that you can put on the box. At best, you can maybe call another service from your serverless infrastructure. But how does that play into all of this? Because that's pretty quickly going to be, or it is at least feels like starting to become the major area that a lot of these players, whether it's Amazon or AWS, or, excuse me, they're the same thing, Amazon or Azure or GCP, all seem to be moving in that direction to some regard. And a lot of companies are starting to explore that as a good way of saving costs from running, instead of running infrastructure, you run a serverless function. So how does that impact, or how does that affect all of this?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's one that we're continuing to see pop up quite a bit because of obviously the natural progression towards serverless, which by the way is the worst term ever, right? So I think right now it's while it's still a concern, we have to understand where we are, we as consumers, as developers, we're consuming the serverless functions. Right now, I see a lot of that happening within the same service provider. So if we look at, I'm gonna deploy my app and using Amazon, all Amazon type of functions. I'm using Kinesis, I'm using S3 and compute and all of these, and kind of wrap all of that in there. When it's inside of a single provider, it's not as big of a deal, because you can go to that provider and say, give me the list of validations that your services have. So if I'm running PCI workloads as an example, I can get a list from Amazon that says, okay, all of this has been validated from PCI service provider. I'm good to go. I can use those. Where I think this will eventually lead to is multiple service providers being used by a given application architecture. Sooner or later, we're going to start crossing boundaries from a serverless perspective, from internal to external, to Amazon, to Azure, to GCP, or whoever. And that's where we start saying, okay, from a security perspective, we've got to map this out, understand what the dependencies are, and understand what these providers are able to do from a security perspective. These providers are able to provide services for PCI, for FedRAMP, for HIPAA, for whatever even your internal security requirements are.
And do any of the providers make that easy in terms of, do they have that as maybe part of their marketing or part of their kind of pipeline process that they try to wrap you into that ecosystem? Do they say, hey, if you want to do PCI, here's the architecture that you use, here's how you use it, here's how it all maps together in terms of the data flows and the diagrams? Like how easy is it for a consumer to readily make that assessment for themselves?
I will say it's a lot better now than it has been in the past. In the past, it used to be very difficult, and I actually ran security for a few different service providers in the past. So it's kind of part of our role as well. I think today's cloud service providers especially are doing a lot better because they're getting a lot more pressure from their customers on it, and especially even in the pre-sales type of model. So in the larger deals that are going down, a customer goes to service provider and says, hey, look, I want to run all of this in the cloud, but these are my requirements. And that becomes a part of that pre-sales element. As far as developers just looking at what the service levels are and compliance levels are of some of these service providers, I think Amazon is doing a really good job. Azure's doing a really good job. They both have areas of their website you can go to that actually will list out the different compliance standards and what services that are included in those. And so in the case of both Amazon and Azure, they're adding their services. As they're adding services to their portfolio, they're adding them to the list of things that can be consumed for PCI as an example. But I think that's an important note too, that I think from the listener's point of view is that if you are using, let's say, PCI in some of your cloud service providers, the cloud service provider can be validated as being compliant, but the devil's in the details. You have to look into which services are you consuming and which services have they validated, and each of those providers does maintain and publish a list of that.
That's at least good, because people can go back and reference at least some documentation around that, which is beneficial. Now, one of the questions that I had as well is, how do you deal with the situation when you used to have a single application consuming a number of microservices, where now that single application is actually the microservices unto itself? How does that muddy the waters in all of this situation?
Yeah, so a lot of this is this risk inheritance model that actually gets stacked on top of each other. So it's not only services consuming services. It's if you start down at the network level, network hypervisor, and then orchestration, and then services built on top of all of those things, and then other apps consuming those services that are built on top of all these things, and the whole thing comes falling down very, very quickly if one of those pieces at the bottom doesn't match the security rule, because it's a foundational element. So let's take an example of, I've got hypervisor, I've got services, I'm building a storage services and object store services on top of this that my applications are consuming, but my hypervisor does not meet the same level of security requirements or security scrutiny. Well, that's your attack vector, right? So everything that sits on top of that is affected now by that non-compliance, or that one thing that doesn't meet that foundational element of the hypervisor. But to your point, there are large scale, especially in the cloud type of environments, all of this stuff is stacked and stacked and stacked on top of itself. And so even services consume themselves, they consume other services, and they're built on top of services themselves. So yes, to say it muddies the water is probably just an understatement. It becomes very difficult to track.
Oh, Matt, when it comes down to trust, right, when I'm deploying my application, and while a provider could say that they're compliant and or secure, I'm kind of a realist, and I've been covering security for 14 years, and I'm like, everyone's going to have a vulnerability. And a lot of the security that I've seen recently is really building it inside the application itself. What are typically your recommendations for security inside of applications or containers that are being hosted serverless or in someone else's environment that give us the right telemetry and protection?
Yeah, so especially when we start looking at things like Kubernetes and some of the Docker Swarm clusters that we're seeing, it provides some unique opportunity, to your point, to build some of those security services in. You can actually build an entire stack of security service, whether that's telemetry, whether it's something like Istio, which is a service mesh type of item that is another container in the cluster that manages app-to-app authentication on what apps can talk to it and not. So, but I think especially in some of the newer technologies where we have lighter weight, lower cost, we can build that stack into our app deployment cluster for an incremental cost to the overall deployment. So, whether that's telemetry, Istio, service mesh, even from a storage perspective, you now are able to package it up and deploy it, and it makes it much more of a known quantity. We almost like shift it back into, well, I know everything on this server is good. Similar to that, I've automated everything into this particular cluster and it's good. And then I have to worry about kind of the ancillary services at that point.
Cool.
So another thing, speaking of providers and kind of trying to solve some of these security problems, what challenges come into play for the whole idea of, okay, they're trying to secure elements of the vehicle that they're delivering or the platform that they're delivering? Does that necessarily equate to security across the entire ecosystem because of the work that they've done? I know, again, Amazon is a pretty big leader in this space of providing new services and functionality that they're offering in the security space themselves, right? They're not going out to a third party anymore. They're building it in-house. Does that necessarily mean that the different platforms by their very nature are now secure?
I would probably love to hear Paul's take on just that last comment alone, but I'm pretty sure I know what it's going to be. But yeah, I think some of the work that they're doing as it relates to exposing some of the underlying services that are very security focused. I mean, if we look at, Amazon's working on something now. I don't even know if they've released it, but it looks at a given subscription's all of their security rules, and then you can ask it programmatically, ask this API a Boolean question of, is this service exposed externally? Is this service exposed internally? So it allows us as consumers to wrap additional security services around those, that one type of API, because it provides more transparency. It's a faster discussion or faster question that you can ask the infrastructure. But inherently does not necessarily make it secure, obviously. But I think the providers are getting pushed more by the consumers to provide those type of tool sets to meet the different security requirements. I mean, I think traffic visibility is a huge problem that we have in the cloud, and not being able to see some of that underlying traffic. That's a huge problem to solve. And I think they're going to continue to get pushed that way and start to expose more as they can build those services out.
Yeah, and I think it's a matter of how they build those services securely, right? Because if Amazon just were to willy-nilly let people start mirroring traffic virtually, that could be bad. That's probably one of the reasons why it's a slower and more kind of calculated project to say, I want to see the traffic to my virtual server container, whatever the case may be.
It's definitely a very hard problem to solve, and especially at the scale as to which they're operating, to be able to slice up that pie as that data flows is a very difficult problem to solve. Although if we see the shift more to containers, there's a lot more that can be done in that kind of space, obviously.
So what sort of guidance is there for consumers out there as they try to solve some of these problems? Is there any sort of, standards or even just white papers or things that some of our listeners can go and check out in terms of ways in which they can start to approach this problem?
That's a great question. And when I was starting to do the research for this talk, I began to, the thought came to me out of the different difficulties that I was seeing in the environment for how I interacted with different groups and different people. And then I started doing some research on, well, there's a lot of talk about microservices architecture out there. Surely they got to have something out there. And it's kind of interesting to see that of all of the non-exhaustive research that I would say that I've done, I have come across very little in the ways of best practices, or even of the microservices architecture ways, mentions of security in general. I just don't see it a lot. So I think some of it's because it's new. I think some of it has not been pushed to a head in some certain circumstances. A lot of it's being deployed and managed right now at the larger enterprise level. But I think a lot of this stuff is going to bubble down to even some of this, mid-market enterprise we'll see. And that's where it's going to become really important. So I don't see a lot out there. Even looking into the ITIL, which is obviously a services-based standard, there's a lot that talks about service planning, but there's not a lot of specifics around security in that. So if an organization is clearly running ITIL, clearly there's the where you inject, if you're doing services planning, inject that whole process of what's the consumers that will be consuming this service, what are the security requirements that are needed, and then you kind of making it at that point. But yeah, it's an interesting kind of barren landscape out there from a security perspective on the standard space on this.
And so for anyone, before they go out and grab ITIL, is there any sort of advice you have around, getting visibility around consumption for some of these microservices or some of the kind of frameworks that they have? And maybe are there any good ways that they go about doing that first?
Yeah, so another difficult problem to solve. What I have seen is there are a lot of agent-based tools right now that organizations are using to map out just from a pure traffic connectivity perspective. So, different tools that are agent-based tools that either are there from a network segmentation perspective, if we see somebody like a Lumio, or there's a few different providers in that space, and then or just agent-based tools that allow us to gather network traffic and analytics. I've seen some people take that approach purely just on the fact of we don't know what some of our applications are talking to, so we need to actually go look at the connections and track that down. Other than that, I've seen a lot of organizations look at just doing software dependency mapping. So understanding this particular software has these dependencies in order for it to operate. It's connected to Kafka, Cassandra, and databases, and even externally it's connecting to S3, and just doing the dependency mapping. These are all of the things that my particular application needs to function. And then basing that into these are the services that my organization is consuming internally and externally, and then filing that into categories of these are what these services can operate with. These are the services that the security levels that they can provide, and then you can have a better understanding of the landscape. So right now we see it's a lot of manual labor with the addition of some tools.
And Paul, I don't know if you have any other questions before we jump into Application Security Weekly's 5 questions.
I do not.
All right. So with that, Matt, first question off of the 5 questions for Application Security Weekly. What were the specs like on your first computer?
Oh, many years ago. So I couldn't afford my own computer till I was in college. So my dad had an old i386. I couldn't even tell you the specs on that. I think my first purchased computer was probably in the early 90s and was, I think, a Pentium 60 with a whopping 4 meg RAM. Does that sound about right?
Sounds about right. I'm sure you were cruising on the internet back on AOL in those days, as it were.
Listening to modem tones for sure. Modem tones for sure.
Yep. So given the time frame of getting into computing, what programming language did you learn first? And do you enjoy writing any code today?
So I started probably with Perl, I think, Perl, then Bash early on. All of my coding history has been interpreted languages, not compiled languages. But Perl and Bash kind of ran into the original ASP, and then a lot of PHP back in the late 90s. And then, yeah, I still do development today, some Ruby Rails, Python, and a little bit of everything from a scripted language perspective.
Nice. So I've got to ask, given when you started computing, Vim or Emacs, or maybe VI or Emacs?
VI originally, and then Vim all the way. I still use Vim today. Yes, every day.
Perfect. That's a good way to live. So the other question, though, especially given that you work in interpreted languages, inquiring minds need to know: spaces or tabs?
It's like a Silicon Valley episode. Tabs.
Wow, tabs. We don't hear very many tabs users these days, but glad to have your representation on the show. Lastly, of course, what sort of advice would you give to newcomers in the industry for those that are interested in getting started?
Something that's I think served me pretty well is never stop learning. All the new stuff that comes out, I try very hard to get my fingers in it, understand it, figure out how today's enterprises are going to adapt to the problems of containers and virtualization and serverless and all those kind of things. And it's the hockey stick will continue to move up and to the right. The way that the IT world will fundamentally consume services and move is going to continue to go faster and faster and faster. And that will continue to be a problem for security. So I think that's a huge element that, to the extent that you can keep learning and read up on everything that's coming out and understand it and figure out how it's going to apply, because it's going to hit your plate probably sooner rather than later.
Awesome advice. So with that, thank you, Matt Springfield, for joining us. Go check out his talk at InfoSec World called Evolution of Security Architecture in a Services-Based World. We're going to be at RSA, or at least Paul and his crew is going to be at RSA next week, so go say hi to them. Thank you, everyone, for listening to another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git, commit, and stay classy.